freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Happy holidays and welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am your host, Nico Perino. On July 25th of this year, we published an interview with Jacob Mushangama. In that interview, we discussed a Cato Institute essay series about the state of free speech internationally. You might recall that Jacob wrote the lead essay for the series, and in it he wondered whether the world's centuries-long march toward freedom of expression has halted, as free and unfree states across the world are in the process of copying one another's restrictions on expressive freedoms. Reading Jacob's essay, it is clear he is a strong supporter of free speech. But not everyone in Cato's essay series agreed with Jacob's take. Among them is our guest on today's show, Anthony Leaker. Anthony is a principal lecturer in cultural and critical theory at the University of Brighton in the UK. And Anthony believes that Jacob's argument amounts more or less to free speech alarmism, and that his claims of a recent free speech crisis are mythical. He is skeptical of the free speech narrative generally, and titled his essay, Against Free Speech, with free speech being in quotation marks or inverted commas as they refer to them in the UK, and Anthony refers to them actually at the beginning of this episode. Anthony sees our current free speech narrative as a sort of Trojan Horse for the far right wing and for fascist propaganda. And to the extent that there are purported victims of any free speech deprivations, they are the powerful, not the persecuted. In that sense, Anthony doesn't see the narrative surrounding free speech being used as a liberating force against oppression, at least not in the West. Jacob responded to Anthony in the essay series and on our podcast in July, but I've been wanting to have Anthony on the show for quite a while to discuss his perspective. But he was working on a book, also called Against Free Speech, and that book was originally set for publication this past November, so I held off until the book hit bookshelves. Unfortunately, the book's publication was pushed back a little while until next year, as is often the case with books. But in any case, Anthony agreed to come on the show in advance of the book's publication, and so here we are. This is one of those deep dive podcasts. Anthony and I have two very different perspectives on how free speech is discussed and protected across the world today, and those differences are on full display here. But in any case, I think you might be surprised to find that there is actually much that Anthony and I agree upon. I enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. So now, on to the show. So Anthony Leaker, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you, in your essay for the Cato Institute, say that you are against free speech, and you have a book coming out that I'm assuming will be an expansion of this essay. And I just wanted to begin this conversation by exploring what it actually means to be against free speech and your conception of it.
Yeah, so I should clarify that I would like to be against free speech in inverted commas, because I think to be against free speech in itself is impossible or stupid or idiotic as it doesn't, or self-defeating. There are many ways of challenging the notion of being against free speech. So firstly, I should say that as a title, it is polemical.
Of course.
But I do have a whole set of arguments that I'll try and outline. But so against free speech in inverted commas, I realise that's quite a kind of irritating postmodern / post-structuralist gesture to put things in inverted commas or quotation marks. But what I mean by that is that free speech today or now or in the last 3 or 4 years has become so fetishized or so narrativized or misused that it's become an ideological tool that is becoming increasingly removed from its true ideal. And so that's really what I want to argue against, is against the way in which free speech is being used. Having said that, I do think there are some useful arguments to be made against free speech as a principle, because I think the invocation of principle is a means of evading looking at some of the practical circumstances or consequences of the way free speech is used. So every time free speech is invoked as a principle, it is a deflection away from talking about the particular issues. So I do think that principles themselves, liberal democratic principles, need to be interrogated.
Yeah, one of the things that I was very interested in talking with you about after reading your essay is whether you just dislike the cultural discourse surrounding free speech, or are you actually in favor of implementing stronger regimes of censorship and speech codes, or is it a little bit of both?
Yeah. Well, I haven't, this is going to sound evasive. I mean, I'm not against speech codes, but more importantly, I think that they already exist, and not only the ones that are seemingly egregious or outrageous, or these kind of 60-page documents that universities, for example, have with all of these different codes and guidelines and rules. I can see precisely why, Fire or Spiked Online or other organizations would be against those. They can seem absurd, but what I would like to argue for is the recognition that language in all contexts, whether in a university or in business or in the media, is already deeply coded and policed, and that censorship, if you like, operates in all areas all the time, and there doesn't seem to be that much recognition of that in the dominant discourse around free speech that I read coming from the mainstream press. There's this kind of assumption that free speech is a sort of straightforward ideal or principle or set of practices, and I don't think it is. I think all contexts imply a set of rules and codes, and most importantly, power structures. So I wouldn't really want to get drawn into saying I'm in favor of speech codes or censorship or hate speech laws, because I think I would want to take that on a case by case basis.
There's one thing that you do in your essay in describing free speech. You say it's often used today by some free speech advocates as a Trojan horse, as cover for some of their more retrograde ideas.
Yeah.
You say free speech crisis is a self-serving myth manufactured or at least capitalized on by people like Tommy Robinson, Geert Wilders. I'm assuming you would also lump people like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos into that category. And in those cases, I think I'm sympathetic to your argument. It does seem as though they have gotten immense criticism for their ideas, and they have seized upon the cultural capital that free speech has to say this is a debate about free speech, not my ideas. But at the same time, I do think their critics give them that argument by actually censoring them in certain cases. For example, Tommy Robinson speaks at Columbia University, and his speech is shouted down, and he's not actually able to give the speech. So I do think he has an argument there, and it distracts from what otherwise would be a conversation about their ideas. Do you not agree with that?
I don't know why Tommy Robinson was ever invited to Columbia University. So to that extent, by all means, put me in the disinvitation camp. How did it come about that these people? I don't think 10 years ago Tommy Robinson would have had the kind of profile he has today. And
for our listeners in America, can you just kind of describe who Tommy Robinson is?
He is, he's most known for being kind of critical, at best being, in friendly terms, it being critical of Islam, but in my view being Islamophobic. But he was a member of a group called the English Defence League. He's now in UKIP, which is the UK Independence Party, which was instrumental in bringing Brexit about. It was kind of quite successful as a fringe political party up until about 2 years ago. It's now not doing so well. But yeah, he's sort of He is. Richard Spencer isn't a bad equivalent. He's a spokesperson for various political organisations, nearly all on the right, if not on the far right. And yeah, most famously, he has been arrested a couple of times, I believe, for contempt of court, which is potentially damaging a court case against a group of men who are accused of prostitution, I believe.
So do you draw a distinction then between what speech should be allowed in a university context and what speech should be policed in broader society by, say, the government? And it's in the United States, and I'm not quite as familiar with the system overseas, but in the United States, a lot of public universities are a functionary of the government, so they're bound by the First Amendment. But how do you think about that distinction?
I again, I would want to say, can we just have some recognition of the way in which language is policed all the time? The way in which language or conversations or views and opinions are framed and structured and conditioned by a whole set of unwritten codes, conventions, rules. And usually, and this is going to come across as a generalization, but usually I would say in most of these circumstances, they privilege white, straight men. And I would say the university is no different to that. I think the university is structured in such a way, and that could be the seminar space or lecturing in a set of ways that have a history. University teaching, university courses, university outlines, university hierarchies have a history, and they have traditionally privileged a certain form of individual, and that obfuscates their gender and their race and their class. But these are white, middle class, straight men, and so I am in favor of trying to challenge that. But I'm not in favor of kind of giving. I mean, this is where I kind of agree with you probably. I mean, I don't think the solution is to empower the government. I don't think the government is the ideal solution. I mean, this is where I wouldn't be in favor of censorship, or I wouldn't be in favor of legal redress. I mean, I ideally I would like to change the kind of conversation. I mean, can I just quickly mention? I mean, I listened to Jonathan Haidt on your podcast. I think it was a month or two ago, where it was the panel discussion around is there a free speech crisis on the universities, and there was Andrew Sullivan and Andrew Sachs, I believe, and
Suzanne Nozzle.
And Jonathan Haidt said, he said the most important thing. I'm paraphrasing, and he might correct me, but he said we need to think about the narratives. And he presented 3 different narratives. He said, we can look at data and we can think about surveys, but what's most important are the narratives. And that I actually disagree with almost everything Jonathan Haidt has written about free speech, but that I agree with him. The crucial thing here are the narratives. I was quite surprised to hear him say that, because that's the kind of thing that a cultural theory lecturer like myself would say, that what matters here are narratives of the stories that are being heard. It's these constructions, and in my view, these lead to kind of myths. And the narrative of free speech being under threat at university is what I would want to challenge.
Well, yeah, I guess the impasse that I have in understanding that argument is challenged in what way? I mean, we can talk about how speech should be viewed, but if it doesn't actually lead to any cultural changes, either legal or otherwise, what are we actually looking to accomplish in this case?
Well, say a student of color objects to, I don't know, a given text or something that was said in university, or a given. I mean, you would be more familiar with some of the controversies that have taken place in the States than I would around race. But generally, the pattern that I witness is that there'll be an incident, and the particulars of the students protesting, the particulars of their argument or their case or what they are criticizing, doesn't get heard. What gets heard is that free speech is under threat in campuses. And so what I would like to see change is different voices being heard, different voices actually having the opportunity to make their critiques on major platforms, so in major publications. I know if you really seek them out, you can kind of find the arguments that in student newspapers or elsewhere, that some students have made some really valid criticisms of certain to their mind, racist or sexist or transphobic practices, and they seem like very convincing arguments to me, but they very rarely get heard. What happens is that free speech gets invoked, and it's a kind of deflection. It's a deflection away from the particulars of the argument, and you get this argument about principles, and it's evasive. It's avoiding the particular issues that these students are raising.
Can't we simultaneously try and raise those students' voices and concerns up while also standing steadfast against any calls that might be inherent in that narrative for censorship? I'm reminded of a common line among the waves of student protests that occurred here in about 2015, 2016. I don't know if there was a similar wave overseas, but it was students expressing many valid concerns about the environment for racial, sexual, gender injustices on campus. But as part of some of those demands, and you can actually go to the demands.org to see a lot of these students' demand, there were calls for explicit speech codes.
Right.
And the position of FIRE was a nuanced one that kind of gets lost in the culture war battle. It's like these students have a right to their voices, their protests should be protected, but at the same time, to the extent that they're making any demands for censorship, those need to be stood fast against. And then, of course, we always make the argument about why free speech and academic freedom and free inquiry are crucial to the mission of a university. Is it possible, you think, to do that? Or do you think that that's going to be a challenge?
I mean, I'd like to think it's possible. I mean, this is complex because it's sort of partly to do with the relation between organizations like FIRE or the students themselves and the mainstream media. It is true that FIRE has a nuanced position. I mean, it is true that FIRE, some of the cases you defend, it seems to me, from across the spectrum, right?
Of course, yeah.
If you look at the case, but the representation of FIRE possibly in the views of some, or in certain representations that I've read, is that FIRE is similar to someone like Spiked in the UK. And I know you interviewed Brendan O'Neill on your podcast. I mean, in my view, the Spiked are provocateurs. I mean, they are just out to provoke. I don't think there's anything nuanced whatsoever about anything they do. And I think FIRE has, rightly or wrongly, been associated with them to a certain extent, or is associated with the kind of unsafe speech tour that took place in the States a year ago. Is that true?
We had one person speak on one of the panels about a regulation in the United States called Title IX.
Yeah.
But no, we weren't a sponsor, I don't believe, of that. Spiked, and I have many friends over there.
Yeah.
Spiked's mission is much more expansive than ours. I mean, they're involved in the Brexit discussions and a lot more cultural issues. Our mission is very narrowly focused on the First Amendment and First Amendment values, and our position is that we agree with generally how the Supreme Court has outlined speech protections here in the United States. We think it is a sophisticated view at both the harms that can be coupled perhaps with speech when we're talking about true threats or incitement to imminent lawless action, while leaving a wide girth for participation in the democratic process, which we think requires open discourse, sometimes offensive discourse. But our cases come from across the political and ideological spectrum. We just defended a professor at Rutgers University successfully who criticized white gentrification in Harlem. We're at the front lines of front lines of defending a professor at Temple University who's very critical of Israel. But at the same time, we defend strong defenders of Israel and sometimes speakers whose speech has been accused to be racist or maybe even is racist. We'll defend to the extent that a university allows people to rent out space on campus. It's a public university. If Richard Spencer wants to rent out that space, we believe he has a right to do so. We also believe that students have a right to raise their voices in opposition to it, and that universities must protect those protests. So it's a very stick to the First Amendment approach. At private universities, it's more of a moral argument about what values a university should uphold in regard to academic freedom and free inquiry. But we're not so much a cultural commentator in that sense.
No. Yeah, I heard your colleague, I think Will
Creeley?
Yeah, I mean, he was saying, it annoys me the way that the FIRE get wrapped up in these culture wars. That's not what we're doing. We're taking, just look at our casework, please. And I thought that was great. I thought he sounded great. So I would say on the one hand, that sounds really great what FIRE are doing. But So in practical terms, it's really great work, and it's very, very valuable that there's an organization holding universities to account and that is doing this kind of work that possibly no one else would be doing, that the media wouldn't be doing, or I can't imagine how difficult it would be individually to get legal redress for these issues. So in practical terms, I think that's great. But the philosophically, it presumes neutrality, right? So this defense of the First Amendment doesn't address structural inequality. It doesn't address the power imbalance. It doesn't address the fact that predominantly the people who suffer the most from offence being protected are the people who are already suffering the most because of structural and other forms of inequality, right? It's just evident to me that in the United States, as in the UK, there are very, very serious structural problems of racism and other forms of discrimination, sexual discrimination, gender discrimination, and that something needs to be done to address that. And that the argument that, well, we're defending all, it's just neutral and we'll defend all cases. Well, that's kind of good, but is it really in the long term going to address some of the more egregious injustices that exist because of structural inequalities?
Legally, I don't know how you do anything but adhere to neutral principles without vast abuses of power. One of the things that, and I know you have more of a cultural narrative concern here.
Exactly. Yeah. Of course.
Yeah. So
legally,
I don't want to say that you're in favor of legal regimes of censorship, but one of the confusions that occurs to me in seeing some of the protests on campus is at the same time that you are protesting against an administration, for example, it could be on campus or it could be the Trump administration that abuses its power, and that allegation can be true or false. We'd have to look at any individual case, but that's the allegation. At the same time, we want to give them more authority to determine this abusive authority, more authority to determine what speech should occur on campus or which speech should be privileged or unprivileged on campus. And in the United States, our appreciation for the First Amendment, at least within liberal circles, and I know you are a strong critic of neoliberalism, which we can get into, or at least that's a suggestion from your essay.
I am, 100%.
Yeah, but that all stems from a history in the United States of suppression of the voices of civil rights activists, of gay rights activists, of women's suffragists activists, and you have a Samuel Johnson quote in your essay. You said, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from slave drivers?" Well, some of the loudest yelps for liberty in the United States historically for free speech have come from people like Frederick Douglass, like Ida B. Wells, who wrote for the newspaper The Free Speech, like Martin Luther King, like the current Congressman John Lewis, who said that the civil rights movement without free speech would have been a bird without wings. So while I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you're saying, I'm just, again, at that impasse. It's like, yes, we should be including as many voices in the process, in the conversation as possible. But we can't abandon free speech, especially in an era where we're seeing, as you write in your essay, rising authoritarianism, both domestically and in countries outside the United States. I just don't want to give an inch on this idea of who can and cannot speak in a democracy. And I don't want to start that calculation of, okay, well, we need to determine just what the power imbalance might be here, how investigate people's backgrounds, how marginalized their voice be. I just don't see how you conduct that analysis or construct that calculation.
Well, I don't either. But I am talking about a kind of cultural set of narratives, and I am really talking about the culture war that's going on. And so it seems to me that there's been such a kind of powerful set of narratives around there being a free speech crisis, or both a free speech crisis on university or free speech and crisis in general.
And Fire's never argued that, to be clear. I think you listened to the podcast in which we explicitly said we don't have a position. But I think it's hard for free speech advocates not to be caught up in that. So what I argued in the essay was
the onus is on true defenders on free speech, right? So the onus is on you to distinguish yourself from firstly the right wing co-option of it, or not right wing, but the far right co-option of it, right? To yes, okay, that's true about Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells, in that free speech has been in the service of all sorts of very just causes, but it seems to me it's shifted, right? The role it's playing ideologically and the role it's playing as a kind of tool of critique has shifted in the last 10 or 15 years. And why is that? Why has that occurred? I mean, that's one of the things I'm trying to think about. How has it come about that free speech is now most often associated, at least in the UK, with these kind of demagogues, or with these,
Well, it might be, and I don't have any strong theory here, but it might be because the institutions that have, I guess, so you see a lot of these conversations happening on college campuses, and the argument is that conservatives or far right or right wing individuals or groups are censored on these campuses, and it's the left in most of these universities that have some sort of cultural hegemony, if not administrative power. And so the idea could be we're seeing allegations of censorship or even just cultural criticism that some people, we can loop Milo Yiannopoulos in here, that's so intense that they feel as though it ventures almost into a free speech discussion, when that's rightly or wrongly. And you can maybe see this in the culture generally, where the left, broadly speaking, and I hate using those terms, seems to have a cultural stranglehold on the media, on movies.
If only.
Yeah. But no, that's exactly my point. Where in the middle part of the century, we look at the purge of alleged communists from the movie industry, and it seemed as though the right, the America Firsters back then, held all the wheels of power, and so the censorship was of those who didn't hold that cultural power, which was those on the left. So you're seeing a shift where the left is not taking over the culture necessarily, but has more say in the culture, has more power in the culture. And so you're seeing the wheels of censorship turn in a different direction. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that America is nothing if not a pendulum. When it swings one way, it swings the other way. And my concern, as someone who's kind of apolitical, but has sympathies to the left, is that it will swing back the other way. And if we knock down the walls that allow for these neutral principles, we're pursuing expediency more than anything else. And you see this in the United States all the time right now with the removal of, for example, 60 votes required to confirm a Supreme Court justice. You get rid of that, as the Republicans did for Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. Great, you might get Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, but there might be a moment when you're not in power. And so you want those checks and balances. And so I guess that's a long-winded way of my kind of exploration of why we might be seeing the narrative shift, and we might be seeing the victims or alleged victims of censorship be more on the right than they were when Martin Luther King was marching into Selma, for example.
Well, I mean, my explanation would be, or one possible explanation, is that this all needs to be viewed in the context of the financial crash of 2007 and 2008. So you have this major economic disaster, which has a huge impact in the UK and the US and in the rest of the world. And then 5 years later, you get this, in the broadest sense, culture war, both in the UK and the US. And, in a kind of smaller part of that is this ongoing sense of free speech being in crisis, or a narrative about free speech being in crisis, there being a free speech crisis. So what's the relationship between those things? Well, it'd be pretty hard to fully establish it, but clearly there is a politics of reaction that exists, that has brought about Brexit, that's brought about Trump, that brought about massive support for Le Pen in France, and elsewhere across Europe, the support for these ethno-nationalist discourses, or ethno-nationalist politicians, I should say, who use ethno-nationalist, racist, if not white supremacist narratives to garner support from the so-called left behind, from these apparently disempowered and disenfranchised groups of people. But what caused that disenfranchisement, right? What caused that disenfranchisement was, yes, neoliberalism, and in particular the financial crisis. And so politicians are capitalizing on this economic crisis and using culture and using cultural narratives as a way of gaining support and also avoiding addressing any of the deeper structural problems, which are to do with quite extreme form of capitalism that is producing mass inequality both in the US and in the UK, where you've got an increased division between the richest and the poorest, which seems to be only getting worse. So I would want to see this kind of obsession with culture as a result of a failure to address anything concrete with the economy. The economy hasn't changed. The economic system, if you like, hasn't changed since the financial crisis. So where's people's at? Where are people going to, and liberal democracy itself has been massively undermined. Everything that you've kind of said in defense of free speech, in principle, I agree with, but in the concrete situation in which we both exist, in the political circumstances in which your vote is cast and which my vote is cast, well, it's largely, I mean, a farce is a bit too strong, but we do live in a kind of post-democratic age, or in an age where liberal democracies are seriously under threat, right? With your president, I mean, probably if we get into talking about your president, we might never end. But there are problems, right? There are clear threats to democracy in both the US and in the UK, where democracy is threatened. So this idea that there's this neutral marketplace of ideas, that if we just bring all these ideas out into the sunlight and that we can have an open and free debate and the truth will out, it just seems remarkably naive. It makes sense in John Stuart Mill. It makes sense in the seminar space that we can all sit together and we've got this established set of presuppositions and guidelines that will help us, explore difficult or challenging ideas and come out and we're all interested in truth. Well, that is not how democracies are operating now. Democracies are chasing, it's a politics of fear, it's a politics of race baiting, etc., etc.
How much of the Trump election and the Brexit referendum do you think stemmed from people feeling as though they didn't have a voice except in the ballot box? For example, I have a lot of friends, I'm from the Midwest here in the United States, a lot of friends and family who felt like culturally they couldn't say what they actually felt. And so going to the ballot box and voting for Donald Trump was one way for them to express themselves in sort of a private or semi-private
but what
sphere.
Is it that they felt they couldn't say? What are these things? This is used all the time, right? There's these things that people feel they can't say. I don't know what they are.
Well, in the United States, it might be certain feelings about immigration.
Right.
In Brexit, that might also be the case. Now, I can't say
even though immigration is never out of the news. This is what I don't understand. Why do they feel afraid to say these things when it's one of the most dominant discussions in the mainstream press?
Well, and I think the argument would be, and to lay my political cards on the table here, I'm a pretty open borders libertarian in that sense.
Yeah.
But the argument would be there is a, quote, correct and incorrect position on immigration. And the narrative that you see is the one that comes from mainstream media, perhaps, and they're the ones that present the correct opinion. And because it's a left-leaning opinion, and those who hold contrary opinions are painted as racists or sexist on a lot of these different issues. They just feel like, well, it's not even worth speaking up because I'm just going to get labeled something that I don't see myself as. And I saw that I lived in New York City at the time of the Trump election. I actually was up the night of the election. It was one of the most surreal evenings of my life. I actually left my apartment at a certain point and I walked to the area where all the TV stations broadcast. And I walked over to NBC and you could see people crying. Then I walked a couple of blocks over and I went to Fox News and people were cheering, they were wearing their red MAGA hats. And one of the reasons it was so surreal to me, because it painted the divide in America over 2 city blocks. And also, I lived in New York City. I didn't know a single person who voted for Trump, nonetheless, even like had any sympathies for him. But then I talked to my family back from Illinois, and they didn't know a single person who voted for Hillary Clinton. And there was this divide, and I talked to the family back there, and I say, well, why do you vote for Donald Trump? Or my friends back there, why do you vote for Donald Trump? And they just said, he stood up to political correctness. He said a lot of the things that we felt. And, of course, we can have a debate whether those feelings are justified or unjustified, but they just didn't feel as though they had a voice in the mainstream media. And so the ballot box was their only choice. And in that sense, I think actually democracy is working, and maybe democracy doesn't always give us the outcomes we want. But that's, it's a confluence of things. And when you talk about on campus how there are certain groups, and I think in many cases justifiably, who feel they don't have a voice, I also think about those off campus, those people in middle America whose lives have been gutted, as you put it, by the financial crisis. And I think that there's actually some merit to that argument, but they don't feel like they can. And it's one of the reasons the opioid crisis is so underreported here in the United States. And you're starting to see a little bit more reporting on it, but life expectancy in the United States has dropped dramatically as a result of the opioid crisis. And you'd think there'd be more coverage of it, but so much of our cultural institutions are centered in the coasts that there's just this divide, and it's impossible to bridge. And that's,
I just find it hard to see why they would think their voices aren't being heard, or that they're not able to access the kind of narrative or information or opinion that they seem to think appeals to them or speaks to them, i.e. being anti-political correctness. There's been anti-political correctness going on for the last 25 years or so. Fox News, for example. But even the notion that the New York Times or CNN or other media outlets in the States are left, I mean, that to me is laughable. They're centrists. I don't.
Well, I guess at this point, I should ask you to sort of define neoliberalism, because you would say they're more neoliberal institutions, and neoliberalism is a new word, at least in my lexicon, and I think generally in the cultural lexicon.
Yeah, well, so neoliberalism, the easiest way to think about it is as Reaganism or Thatcherism, which is the privatization of former public goods, so the privatization of gas, water, steel, airlines, you name it. In the UK, almost every previously public industry was privatized, eventually floated on the stock market, etc., etc. So firstly, it's the marketization of industry or public service that the market should govern. I mean, its origins are in Friedrich Hayek and a few other Austrian thinkers who believed that socialism or anything approaching socialism or any form of kind of state-managed economy, whether that's welfare capitalism, was a severe threat to individual flourishing. So they privileged the individual, and they felt that the best place for the individual to flourish is the market. But the consequences of that are that from privatizing public services, you now have almost all areas of life are subject to kind of market logics or to a kind of logic of the metric of measurement. So that could be in terms of dating or in terms of university education, where everything is, driven towards some kind of end of investment, right? Everything has to be viewed under the lens of what's this worth. For example, reading a book is no longer valuable in itself. What's it going to give me? What's it going to do for me? What's it going to add to my CV? How's this going to make me a better form of human capital? So, who should I date? Should I date this person? What will this do for me? Everything's become instrumentalized.
And you would argue that these cultural institutions like the New York Times broadly fit within this sort of rough category.
I don't know about the New York Times. What I'd say about the New York Times and others, and I'd include the Guardian in this, is that they are liberal in the philosophical sense, political liberals, not in the American sense where you distinguish liberal and conservative, but liberals as in endorsing traditional political liberalism, which is the philosophy that comes from John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and up through Mill and through others, which is, I would say, is the basic political common sense of our culture, both the UK and the US. I think the UK and the US have been liberal since America since 1776. I mean, I think the Constitution is one of the great documents of liberalism, and I think there's a lot to be said for liberalism. But in its foundings, liberalism was exclusionary, excluded indigenous people and excluded black people. And white supremacy is the kind of political system that never gets named, but white supremacy in the US has dominated US politics. And in the UK, it's a form of colonialism and kind of post-colonialism. The UK has the UK's liberalism is inextricably linked to colonialism. And so the empire was built through a narrative of promoting the UK as a place for freedom and flourishing and civilization. But this was on the backs of the economic exploitation and political exploitation of all the colonized nations. And this isn't even my argument, right? I should say this is Aziz Rana wrote an amazing book called he's an American academic, I think he's at Cornell. He wrote this great book, I think it's called The Dual Faces of Freedom. And he's saying, American freedom is great, right? It's one of the great inventions of human society that America has enabled people to be truly free. But that freedom has always been for a select group of people. And yes, certain groups of people have managed to enter into that fold, if you like, through campaigning and partly thanks to free speech, as you say, suffragettes and the civil rights movement. But it's still going on. It's still exclusionary. So this is a very long version. So I would say that the New York Times and CNN, they claim to be kind of just neutral, but they don't interrogate the kind of liberalism that underlies everything they do. And as I was saying right at the beginning, this fails to address deeper structural forms of oppression and inequality.
So would you say that you're a Marcusean? And we've talked about him a little bit on the podcast before, but he wrote his critique of pure tolerance.
Yeah.
And from what I can hear you say thus far, I don't think you would go as far as Herbert Marcuse, because he seems to suggest that the laws should change in the direction of what he calls repressive tolerance. I just kind of want to get your sense of where you fit in that philosophical tradition, if at all.
Yeah, I have to confess, I haven't properly read Repressive Tolerance by Marcuse. I mean, I know it and I'm familiar with it, and I probably should read it properly. I've sort of skim-read it. So I wouldn't say I'm Marcusean precisely because I haven't properly engaged with his work.
Yeah, well, we can pivot away from that.
I would say, I'm broadly speaking, would
or the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, I've got a lot of sympathy for the Frankfurt School. I've got a lot of sympathy for Adorno's critique of the culture industry and for I think, it's Adorno and possibly Marcuse, I don't know, but Adorno certainly is interested in the flourishing of individuals, but it's all wedded to a social critique. So Adorno sees capitalism as an all-pervasive kind of ideology that incorporates us and in such a powerful way that when we think we are choosing something, we are kind of under an illusion. I mean, it's much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I am sympathetic. I mean, the label cultural Marxism that's thrown around, that's largely quite a specious label, but I don't necessarily have a problem being associated with some of the things that cultural Marxism's accused of, wanting to get rid of God, for example. I don't have a problem with that. God as a sort of structuring tool in society. I don't have a problem with God as a form of individual belief. If people want to believe in God, great. I'm not a supporter of the new atheists, so I think. But yeah, I shouldn't have gone into cultural Marxism. I think it's not that helpful. I would say, if I believe in socialism, basically.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about John Stuart Mill for a second, because in your essay, you critique how John Stuart Mill is used in this cultural dialogue surrounding free speech. And I'll just quote a second here from your essay. You say that John Stuart Mill is so often called upon to support such a free speech defense is questionable, at best. Mill sought to attack existing social arrangements, whereas today's free speechers seek to defend and preserve them. Mill considered diversity central to social progress, whereas many of his supposed heirs promote fanciful notions of homogeneity. Mill was concerned with the oppressive nature of public opinion. He challenged dogma, stale arguments, and calcified points of view. He challenged custom described as nature. And my reading that, I agreed with almost everything you just laid out there about Mill. He was one of the early campaigners for women's rights. But at the same time, I don't think that negates his arguments in favor of free speech, nor is it easy to presume that he would perhaps take your approach in viewing free speech today. There are many people for whom I think they have good ideas, but they have more sordid pasts, or they have bad ideas, but their pasts are good. So I just want to see what we actually draw from that critique in the context of what it actually means for free speech as a principle.
I mean, okay, free speech is the simplest way I could put this is to say free speech is a great principle, but we need to work on equality first. Free speech only functions properly if society is equal. Now, that might sound utopian, right? So I just said that, look, I probably would consider myself a socialist, but don't ask me how to, to spell that out in terms of what it means practically, and I can't see it in the future. But what it means to me is that equality at the moment in these particular conditions needs to be privileged over freedom, right? So, and this is why I would want to put all these arguments in a case-by-case basis. Of course, if you're subject to a kind of an oppressive regime, if you're under a kind of authoritarian communist regime in the Soviet Union or in East Germany, of course, freedom's vital, and I completely understand why freedom of speech and why freedom as a kind of slogan, not even a slogan, as an ideal to strive for, was what was emphasized the most by the people trying to by dissidents and people trying to critique the system. That completely made sense. But we're not subject to that regime at the moment. We're subject to a regime of extreme freedom for certain groups of people. And therefore, I think what needs to be done is to balance that out with an argument for equality. And it's not that I'm thinking principle equality is better than freedom, but I'm saying in this society where there is such gross inequality, then what we need to promote are narratives and arguments and cases for equality. And that might involve some kind of structural meddling. It might involve speech codes here and there. It might involve affirmative action. It might involve a whole set of other things, because until we've got equality, freedom of speech doesn't mean much. If it's only free for some people, if only certain people have a platform, if only certain people are heard, then what use is freedom of speech? Right, so that's my main argument. Let's just change the way we're talking about it. We can't keep defending it as a principle if we're ignoring the reality for vast groups of people. And by groups of people, I mean, entire identities, right?
So we need to make society more equal. And equality is a laudable goal, and I will never disagree with you on that. But I think I would disagree in the approach or the tactics to get there, because when I think about power, I think about those who wield it. Maybe I privilege too much institutions and who's in control of those institutions. But in order to achieve this equality, and if you think about it in the free speech realm or any other realm, you need to have someone pulling the levers to make it possible. And I just don't know that there's any person with whom I would entrust the power to restrict my freedoms. How do you ever know when you've reached perfect equality? I mean, it does seem sort of like an utopian goal to me, and one that can only be achieved in certain respects through repression by those in power. And those in power here in the United States right now are people like Donald Trump, people who I assume
I would not support.
You wouldn't. Yeah. But even if it was the perfect angel, mortal angel, none of us are immortal, and they will have successors, and those successors will have the same access to power that their predecessors
but
did.
The true idea of democracy is that the people in power are just representing the interests of the people, right? So if you believe in democracy, then the institutions that are managing the state, for example, and managing the laws, well, they are just there. The people in charge of those institutions are there because they have a mandate from the people. the fact that our democracy is kind of screwed is the problem. But if we had a radical democracy, if we had an actual functioning democracy where the public had a say in all sorts of things and where they were genuinely informed, we had an informed citizenry, not people subject to just endless propaganda, which is what I think the media, for the most part, produce. I don't think they produce much kind of. I think this is where paradoxically Trump is kind of onto something with fake news. The fact that Trump uses fake news as a tool to deflect critique of him, which is propagandistic in itself, but actually, people on the left have been arguing that the news is a very, at best, biased and at worst, completely manufactured form of propaganda or ideology. For years they've been, Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent back in 1984 or something. So democracy isn't functioning if you don't have a properly functioning media and you don't have a properly informed citizenry where politics operates according to all sorts of super PACs or whatever. That's just the fact that Citizens United, for example, the fact that corporations can function as citizens in the States just seems bizarre to me.
Well, we could go down the rabbit hole of campaign
financing, etc.
But I mean, to me, had that particular decision gone the other way, it would have meant that you can't make a movie about a politician something like 6 months before an election. Okay. That just seems to me like because the question there was a corporation, which is of course an amalgamation of people. Often organizing around a certain mission or ideology, and in this case, it was the organization Citizens United, who were opposed to Hillary Clinton, and they made a documentary about her politics. And the government, through its campaign finance rules, tried to say that you can't make that movie. And the principle there, if it was upheld in the Supreme Court, would have extended to the New York Times, which is a corporation, and it would have prohibited them from writing editorials in support of this candidate or against that candidate. So, I mean, that case gets a lot of flack because it seems people argue that it weaponizes the First Amendment and grants corporations certain rights, but I just don't see any way around it if we want organizations like Amnesty International or Greenpeace or the ACLU to be able to have a voice in our political process. There's no other. Okay,
and that would be great in an equal society. But if the most powerful, if a big corporation has a lot more power than Amnesty or Greenpeace, then we are not operating in a marketplace of ideas, let alone a kind of fair playing field.
Well, isn't that the brilliant insight of the Bill of Rights? Is we're not a perfect democracy. The vote protects the voice of the majority, but it's bounded by the rights protected in the Bill of Rights for the individual. And in some cases, there are protections for groups like the right to assemble. But those rights protect the minority of one. They're neutral principles that should and are not always enforced on a viewpoint neutral basis.
Yeah, but if the individual is normalized as a white property owning straight man, then that's a problem, right? This is yes.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to defend the early draft of the Constitution that didn't recognize.
But I'm not sure
right
that things have. I mean, they've changed a great deal, but there are still gross and great structural inequalities, and they are also discursive inequalities. Discursive meaning in the way in which language normalizes certain individuals over others. So this notion of invoking the individual is great in an ideal society, but we don't live neither you nor I live in an ideal society. We live in a society structured by gross inequalities, both economic and political.
Yeah, I guess I just don't see, one, what you can do until we get to that point, and two, how you even get to and maybe we have different definitions of equality. My thought is mostly equality under the law, but I know that you place a great emphasis on the cultural concerns. But when I think of perfect equality, I think of Kurt Vonnegut's essay Harrison Bergeron, in which certain people who are really smart have a buzzing in their ear, so they're not as smart or, people who are super athletic have weights attached to their feet. And I know that's not the equality you're talking about, but that's the recognition of equality under the law, is that nobody's born with talents in every field, but we should recognize, despite the inequalities that we're born with, that everyone should be treated equally by the government. And that's what I hope the First Amendment does. And it doesn't sound like you disagree with.
I don't disagree with that. But the issue isn't just with the government. Again, this is why, for me, the argument about free speech always being about protecting us from the government. I mean, the government is the least of our worries, to a large extent, right? Corporations are very powerful, but also other groups in society are very powerful. Other individuals are very powerful. So I don't think this battle around free speech is purely to do with the government. I'm obviously very sympathetic to the idea that the government should be held to account, and that I don't think the government, especially the kind of ruling governments of the current moment, should have great power. But I am arguing in a kind of slightly more idealistic plane, which is, well, if you want free speech to function, then you need a functioning democracy, and you need to have greater equality. I'm not going to come up with a set of kind of practical suggestions for how equality would be achieved. I'm saying it's something we should aim for. So again, going back to my earlier point, it's about trying to shift the narrative. It's about trying to just it's a recognition, or it's calling for a recognition of the fact that the narrative around free speech in the mainstream media is neither doing a service to you, to FIRE, and to the kind of work that FIRE is doing, and nor is it really doing a service to how free speech should and could function. What it tends to be doing is serving vested interests. At worst, it's serving kind of far-right opportunists and demagogues who, like Tommy Robinson. I mean, I didn't actually finish speaking about Tommy Robinson, but why is he invited to Columbia at the first place? Why is he invited to the Oxford Union? Why are these institutions? Why are some of these people on the BBC? Right, the BBC is having interviews with Marine Le Pen and all of these people. They wouldn't have 10 years ago. Why? And now you could say, well, look, if we hear their views, then they're more likely to dissipate. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, that hasn't worked.
Well, it worked with Milo Yiannopoulos. I mean, it seems like
that's a very specific case of what he disclosed. That's not because of his ideas. That's because he disclosed a particular thing that happened to him when he was younger. I mean,
But we let him talk, and he seemed to defend Pendergastes, and that was, I guess you could say, it was a bridge too far, and I definitely would. But I mean, you might argue that the bridge too far happened far before that. But it was free speech allowing him to air his views. That eventually was his undoing. But let's recognize
there's a bridge, right? And so there are. This is precisely my point. There are limits of what's acceptable. We would all, I hope, argue that paedophilia is wrong, and that there shouldn't be images of, this is a very obvious example to use into events of censorship, but surely there are things that need to be censored. And if you agree that there are some things that need to be censored, then you can't make the case for free speech absolutism, right?
Well, I don't know that I would have censored Milo.
No, but you would censor.
I think
you would censor images of underage children, surely. Naked image.
Oh yeah,
right?
Of course.
So you accept
and of course,
limits.
that limit stems from an underlying crime, which is you can't take pictures of underage children, and also they can't provide the consent that would be even necessary, even if they were adults. So there's an underlying crime at play in there.
Okay, but you don't accept that there are limits that are less egregious than that. There are limits about how one would. Take a really innocent example about how one would speak if one was on TV, and you wouldn't use swear words. You wouldn't use F-bombs, for example, right? Now you could say, well, I'm being censored, but I'm on a morning TV show with Oprah or I don't know who, Ellen DeGeneres,
Well, the First Amendment and free speech, when we're talking about the culture, is a very dynamic philosophy, and the BBC and the BBC is unique because it's a semi-governmental institution. But let's talk about CNN, for example. Yeah. They have editorial discretion as to what they will or will not allow on their platform as a private institution. And that same thing goes for Facebook. Facebook is a private institution, and while I might disagree with how they implement their speech codes, they do have editorial control with what can exist there. My main concern, of course, is with government wielding that power and privileging certain viewpoints over others. But I don't want to dismiss the idea that I have a cultural concern too about what happens when we don't allow people to be who they are and speak their minds.
Okay, so let's go back to that. You said that some of your friends or people you knew in the Midwest, in Illinois, etc., said that they felt afraid to speak up or to express their real issues because they don't see themselves as racist, but they wanted to, express some kind of views about immigration, for example. Or now, I'm not sure that one gets to determine whether you're racist or not. Like, it's not your choice. I can't say, saying I'm not racist. That's the classic racist move. I'm not racist, but so. And I'm not saying that these people are or are not, but it's not up to them to determine whether they are. If they say racist things or think racist thoughts or carry out racist actions, that makes them racist, whether they want to be or not, right? So, but more importantly, what is it? What makes them think that immigration is a problem? Have these people in the Midwest or have the people in the UK, for example, gone out and done the research? Or have they been fed certain narratives from the media that have put into their minds this idea that immigrants, for example, are taking all of their jobs, or that immigrants are a strain on the national economy, or immigrants are, taking advantage of our national health service, right? I doubt very much that people actually know this. These are narratives that have been manufactured by the media. So
let's say I grant you every single thing you just said. Yeah. My question is, how do you overcome that narrative? You allow people to speak up either with their facts or with their prejudices, and we sort it all out. I mean, I think the problem here is that there was a quote unquote correct opinion that those who held cultural power said one must have. And if you did not have that, your voice isn't allowed on campus. It's not allowed on CNN. It's not allowed in the pages of the New York Times. And so people just decided, well, I hold an incorrect opinion. What's the point of me speaking up anyway? So they go to the ballot box, and that's kind of the exhaust valve.
But it's not like there's only the New York Times or the CNN or as media outlets. I mean, there's a whole spectrum in the US, right?
And you have places like
Breitbart. Why do they feel that they're being oppressed by this kind of? Let's just say that there's this culturally dominant, slightly leftist or liberal, politically correct set of values and ways of speaking that dominates. But is it really that dominant in America?
Well, in America, you see most of the free speech conversation surrounding college campuses. Yeah. Now, there's a free press conversation that's happening in the country right now surrounding the Trump administration. Yeah. But on college campuses, you do see, for example, people who are opposed to affirmative action or people who are for stronger immigration
and they feel
laws.
silenced.
Even anything short of like abolishing ICE is considered in some cases, a form of racism. Yeah. And they feel silenced. Now, you and I can have a debate as to whether that's justified or not, but actually, I will say there are cases where you do see people who make these arguments who are subject to disinvitations or disinvitations attempts, or who can't do their affirmative action bake sale on campus. So it does come from somewhere, and I think in the United States, one of the biggest applause lines Trump ever got was when he was speaking at Ohio, and he said he was going to defeat censorship on campus, which I kind of roll my eyes at. But he was visibly, if you see the video, taken aback by the amount of applause he got. I don't think he has any remote idea as to what's happening on campus. But that seems to be where conservatives don't have cultural capital, and that seems to be where the free speech fights are happening. And I can't say they're without merit, because we certainly do see censorship on college campuses. Yeah. And I don't want to say it's exclusively conservative. Yeah. We can circle back here and talk about whether the concentrating on the culture war speech debates is actually very representative of what happens on campus. But anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying I think they do have at least some argument when it comes to college campuses.
I mean, no doubt, and certainly some of the students that I teach here in the UK do claim that there is a kind of, an unwritten set of boundaries about what's acceptable and what's not, and some would want to express views that they feel that if they did, they would be possibly vilified. What I would say to that is, but those views, that there are plenty other spaces to express those views, that those views are those of the mainstream. Those views are the views of the Daily Mail newspaper, which in the UK is huge. It's one of the biggest selling newspapers, or it's the most viewed on the internet. It gets millions of viewers. To make an argument against immigration, it's a very common argument. So yeah, okay, let's say the university is a left space, but I'd rather think of it as a critical space, right? It's a space
then shouldn't they
critiquing
be
what's going on in society. So yes, it's trying to counter the dominant set of narratives and values and arguments that are being propagated by the powerful, by the mass media, by the corporate elite, right? So yeah, the university, and thank you to FIRE for defending academic freedom. The academic freedom is there to be critical of what's going on in the mainstream. And if the mainstream is more right-leaning or more centrist, then it kind of makes sense that a university might be a space that is left, but purely because it's critical. So if the political climate changed in the mainstream, I would assume that the university would change.
Well, I would think that the university, being a critical institution, would welcome these arguments, would welcome these challenges as a place.
Well, we do welcome
where they critique can happen. I don't know that it's necessarily the mission of a university to take a position on every issue and then counter them, as you said.
We do welcome debate, but one of the problems is these arguments have been made for years. So okay, maybe there's a bit of impatience, but the argument, I mean, we could think of the Charles Murray case in the States, but we could think of the case here in, I think it was Oxford. A professor, he's called Nigel Bigger, wanted to kind of start an institute that was trying to, in his view, take a more balanced look at colonialism. Now, I would argue, and others would argue, we don't need a more balanced look at colonialism. We need to be critical of colonialism, right? There was enough promotion of colonialism for the last 150 years. There is enough literature out there promoting colonialism. What we need is to counter that. We need, so this argument that somehow we need to hear more voices that speak to the good things that Britain did while it was colonizing over half the world. No, we've heard that. It's over. The arguments are over.
Isn't the best way to critique an argument to first present that argument and then present it in the most charitable way possible?
But again, this is a structural thing, because this is to do with funding. This is to do with, this is why campuses are attacked in the US, right? Because the campuses do have power, right? It's to do with structure. So it's symbolically someone getting and I don't know if it was an institute or funding or what, or a journal, but someone getting these kind of support has to be challenged. We don't need to. There are some arguments we don't need to hear anymore. The argument against racism has been made. We don't need to hear any more arguments about it. I do not think. I mean, surely there's. Mill would argue
I think
kind of our notion of human progress. This is the point of free speech. We can have the argument. We've worked out what's wrong. See you later. We don't need to keep revisiting. We shouldn't have to keep making the argument as to why racism's wrong.
Well, Mill also talked about the fatal tendency of mankind being to leave off thinking about a thing when it is no longer doubtful. He calls it the deep slumber of a decided opinion. Yeah. I mean, I think the learner and the teacher go to sleep when there's no enemy in the field. That's another Mill quote. And I think it's important to have that enemy and to be confident in your ideas and to challenge them. We're talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds here, some of whom might not have any opinions on these issues. They hear them in the mainstream media. They regurgitate them in your classroom. I think we should be charitable with them, kind to them. You're a very compelling speaker and a compelling writer. I mean, I was very struck by your prose in that essay. I have no doubt that facts will win out in the end. I hope, if we have a neutral playing field here on campus and we allow these ideas to be heard, interpreted, charitably and then defeated.
Yeah, sure. We want to challenge students. We do, but I don't think it's challenging students to hear retrograde ideas. There are new ideas, there are new forms of critique, there are developments
Well,
within particular disciplines that we can focus on. We don't need to hear stale, old, dogmatic arguments about biological racism, for example. I mean, I don't even know what Charles Murray's shtick is. He wrote The Bell Curve. He said something along the lines that it's genetically the case that white people are intellectually more advanced than black. I mean, is that his argument?
I think I haven't read his book, but I think his argument is generally that there are there are differences in IQ across groups, but the greatest differences come within those groups and among individuals. I don't want to defend his book or
but should he be
sort
given
of
a platform?
claim to know exactly.
Should he? I mean,
to the extent his book is a bestseller, people buy into it. I think the university is the best place to litigate those ideas. I mean, it's the place where you hope that institutional disconfirmation can occur. And institutional disconfirmation is this idea that an idea gets presented, and you have systems and processes within the university that ensure that these aren't just dogmatic arguments that are going to be made, but there will always be challenged, because that's how we push knowledge forward. And I know, I'm sympathetic to the idea that we shouldn't have to relitigate whether racism is okay. I'm totally sympathetic to that. But I also understand the history here in the United States that same argument was made on campuses in the 1950s and 60s about communism. And it was the impetus for throwing people out of professorships, for expelling students. You saw the huge expulsion within the movie industry here. I mean, it was taken for granted in the same way a lot of this stuff is taken for granted, that these ideas were bad. And I think cultural Marxism, the Frankfurter School, a lot of these had very valuable things to add to the academy, and the academy was worse off for not engaging with those ideas.
Yeah, but the difference there was that okay, that's broadly speaking McCarthyism, and that was the government that's in power. But what's happening today is that the campus is a counterweight, surely, to the government. The campus is, it's a kind of form of checks and balances. So
well, in the 1950s, Harvard was hosting tribunals and getting rid of.
But they were on the side of the government. That's what I mean. I'm saying that it was all on one side. Everything was stacked on one side. So I don't see the fear around what's going on in the campus. I would see the fear if the kind of politics of the campus was shared by the politics of the U.S. government. But that isn't the case. So they're in dialogue. I mean, in a very loose sense, they're in dialogue, but there isn't this kind of monolithic anti-communist, for example, set of power structures.
But that doesn't mean that will always be the case on campus. If you allow the principle that there are certain ideas that are just beyond dispute to take hold on campus, today, we might love the ideas that have taken hold. But tomorrow, let's say Trump is in power for another 4 years and his administration has more influence. I mean, it could go the other way, and we could be talking about how the idea that climate change is man-made is just de facto not true. I mean, that could conceivably happen sometime in the future. But it's less likely to happen if you allow for this institutional disconfirmation, if you have a culture that allows minority viewpoints to be presented, and you can always count on them to be challenged. And I think that's what the role of a university. I mean, that's kind of the ethos that FIRE takes. And we recognize that not everyone would agree with that, but I'm honest when I say that's what I believe.
I think again, in principle, I agree. And in principle and in practice, in fact, what FIRE's doing in terms of defending particular cases on campus of infringements of free speech is great and admirable. And, we should be very grateful for that, or people in the state should be very grateful for what you're doing. But it doesn't address other issues that need to be addressed, right? And I think that, from my understanding, campus politics or the campus activism or attempts by students to challenge certain forms of oppression that they think exist, this is critique. This is different to trying to establish the kind of law of the land, right? They are coming from a position of critique. Now that doesn't address the kind of speech codes that are come from top down from the kind of institution, right? That is a whole separate issue, and there I'm kind of much more sympathetic to you guys. But in terms of students and in terms of the student voices, well, I just don't think they are as powerful as they're portrayed to be in the media. You know, the famous article, I'm a liberal professor and I'm terrified of my students, or the stuff that Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianov talk about in The Coddling of American Mind. I mean, they portray students as these, or not just them, a whole load of them. They use words like authoritarian, fascist, McCarthyite. There's this kind of apocalyptic, exaggerated language to describe students, and students are not that powerful. I just don't see it. I don't understand this terror of students. They are not Bill Gates. They are not these giant corporations, right? They are trying to just redress the balance. They are trying to challenge norms that, in their view and in my view, are historically oppressive. And that's exactly what Mill was about, right? It's like, let's break down customs. We assume, he wrote in the 19th century, that women can or can't do this. And he says this has just come about through custom. And don't tell me it's natural, because nature is just to come about because of custom. And I think that's what the students are mostly doing. They're trying to establish things that seem normal, but are in fact deeply culturally constructed.
Well, would you say that there are certain tactics that students take that can justifiably be called authoritarianism? To the extent, for example, at Evergreen State College, they wouldn't let the president leave a room, or they take over a classroom at Reed College, or they petition to get professors fired, and in some cases successfully disciplined.
I mean,
for not having a trigger warning for something that they said in class that was. I mean, you must be sympathetic to that in a certain extent, because you live in the classroom.
That's all very possible, and I could well imagine that were I to be sort of shipped over to the States tomorrow and start teaching a class, I'd be terrified and horrified myself. But and that I might well agree with some of these narratives about students and their kind of authoritarian tactics. However, I would want to take a longer view and try and understand why it is that they feel that they're having to use these kind of tactics, right? And I would assume that if they haven't been heard, or if the kind of, people usually resort to extremes because the other tactics they used didn't work. So I'm assuming that students didn't get heard, right? You only start shouting if people don't listen to you.
Well, that presumes that everything the students ask for or argue has merit.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that
possible it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, of course, goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. We need to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But I realize that I've kept you a little bit longer than the hour. So I want to close by just presenting something that I think you and I can agree upon.
Yeah.
I'm dismayed in the way that free speech has become a culture war issue.
Yeah.
And has really minimized the cases of censorship that occur on campus, and that's what I know best because that's where I work, that don't fit a culture war narrative. For example, you don't see headlines written about students at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute that are protesting the university's takeover of the student-run union, or the case at Northern Michigan University, which threatened students with suspension and expulsion if they talked with their fellow students about their depression or thoughts of self-harm. Or the case at the University of North Alabama, which bars staff members and students from speaking with the press. Or the student at Cal Poly Pomona who passes out PETA flyers and is told that he will be punished if he does so outside of the free speech zone. I mean, these don't fit into any culture war narrative, but are just as much an infringements on someone's rights, and they get lost when we make free speech a culture war debate. So I think there's something there for media to look critically at, and for us as those of us who value sort of like the principle of free speech to try and amplify. They amplify these stories, which if you go through our case archive at FIRE, I mean, maybe half, maybe just slightly less than half, fit no political narrative whatsoever. And they're the ones that don't get the attention.
I completely agree with that. And I would advise any listener to read the cases on FIRE, because I think that is a much more nuanced and a much more illuminating narrative of some of the things that are going on campuses, right? I mean, it hasn't been selected. It's not taking one anecdote and trying to build a more general narrative about campus free speech crisis. I think reading those cases is everyone should do it. Anyone who's ever written an article about free speech on campus should be forced to read all of those cases on the FIRE website. So I agree with that, and I completely agree. That the narrative needs to be shifted. Who's responsible for that, though? Who has an investment in this narrative? And I think, not only should the media and cultural commentators take a more nuanced look at the actual cases of free speech infringement on university campuses by engaging with the work that FIRE is doing, but I also think there needs to be more said about the reality of student life on campus and the kind of diversity of student life, right? That for example, students aren't all these kind of privileged activists at high-end schools like Yale, but many of them are working 2, 3, 4 jobs. Some students are working through the night. Students are exhausted. Students are under pressure. Students are in debt. Students are suffering from grave mental health crises. There's a whole set of other stories about students that just don't get heard.
And I will say, I work in the communications department, so I work with journalists a lot. And there have been times where I've pitched publications, stories, and those publications will remain unnamed, where they said, yeah, this is a good story, but the institution doesn't have the name recognition that we'd want to write a story about it. Next time you have a case at Harvard or Yale, let us know.
Yeah.
So, and we have a case right? Yeah, no, it's very depressing. And in that sense, I think your critique of the media is fair. I want to give you the last word here. What can we expect with your book? Anything else you kind of want to plug here before we tune out?
No, well, I just hope I get the book done. The book won't be out until next November, probably. But no, it's been a real pleasure. I think more kind of conversations like this, the better. I mean, one of the odd things about starting to write this book, where I was initially kind of very critical of the way free speech was used, is that the more you read into it, the more you start to appreciate the value of free speech. So I'm still very much have an ambivalent position. So engaging with the Cato Institute and speaking to you and reading more widely is a really useful exercise. So I'd advise anyone who has a kind of fixed position to just, engage in dialogue.
Well, I tell you what, when the book comes out, please do get back in touch. And we organize talks on campus. We're often asked to participate in talks where they ask us who else should be invited. Let me know. We'd love to have you here in the United States to engage in more of these dialogues publicly. So Anthony Leaker, thank you again so much for coming on the show. I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk.
Thanks very much, Nico.
That was Anthony Leaker. He is a principal lecturer in the School of Humanities at the University of Brighton in the UK, and he is also the author of the Cato Institute essay Against Free Speech, which will be expanded into a book by the same name, which should hopefully be available sometime next year. You can find a link to Anthony's essay along with the other essays in the Cato Institute's Cato Unbound essay series about international free speech in this episode's show notes. This podcast is hosted and produced and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. You can learn more about this podcast by following us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/so-to-speak-podcast. You can also email us feedback at so-to-speak@thefire.org. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Reviews, as always, help us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, I want to wish you all a happy new year, and we'll see you in 2019.